Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you today on this Monday. Wherever you are in the world, it's good to see folks in the chat. I feel like it's been I was here yesterday, but I feel like it's been a long time since I recorded for some reason. Actually, I recorded twice yesterday, so we have a Lara and I. Actually, the first time Lara and I were both on Tanky Group Therapy together. So that's coming soon. Um, I'm sure it'll be out probably today or tomorrow on the East is a Podcast feed. So and books are falling behind me. So anyway, everything's going well today, obviously. So make sure to the show, right? Like push the like button, subscribe to the channel, and more importantly than all of that, or equally importantly, share it so that other folks can see it. Do all of those things to help it reach more folks. As I know that this conversation will be, much needed and appreciated by all the folks that we know and the folks that you know who care about humanity and care about Palestine and want to see a free Palestine. And my guests really needs no introduction at this point. Everybody here, I'm sure, is familiar with Dr. Lara Sheehi. We've had a lot of conversations about decolonial psychoanalysis and her work and analysis. She has a forthcoming book on Pluto Press, which she is about to hit send on to the publisher any day now, From the Clinic to the Streets. And of course, the book that she co-authored, which fortunately did not fall down behind me, Psychoanalysis Under Occupation. So, Lara, good to be with you again, friend.
Good to see you always. Thanks for having me.
Always glad to have you. Always good to be in conversation. It's been a while, partly because you were traveling. So you were, and I was trying to remember. I think we did talk after I went back to Oregon, but there may be some things from that come up in this conversation as well, because I think we both this summer have gone to our homes in some respect. And so I guess to start with, I think the thing I'd like to start with is to just hear a little bit about your trip to Lebanon. And I know that you were in Lebanon as Georges Abdallah was released from 4 decades of political imprisonment, the longest held, I believe, the longest European held political prisoner, I believe. And so, I mean, also, obviously, it is Black August, and on some level, I haven't done the intentionality this year to do a lot of specific to Black August programming, which is something that we do normally do. We've obviously had a lot of conversations related to that over the years, but certainly political prisoners and prisoners, in the belly of the beast are definitely on my mind this month, as I know they are on many folks. And, I think it's seeing Georges Abdallah released in this month also, I think is really powerful. So maybe you could just start and share some of what's on your mind from that trip.
Yeah. I mean, it was so moving, right? And just a reminder to folks, I mean, and this is, I think, the power of having the release of a political prisoner and having us really mark it as a win and a victory. He's been up for parole since 1999. And that's the other thing, is not only was he in prison for 41 years, but has been consistently denied release, despite the fact that court after court after court said that he should be released. And this is uniquely tied to the United States. And they're, intervening and saying he's not allowed to be released. And, on his release, you can maybe intuit why, and we can get into it, the things that he's been saying, his militancy, his refusal. But one of the interesting things, and you can see about the ways in which states and power and oppressive systems really do recognize that these moments are wins and victories for us, and that our movement sort of holds on to this and is able to see the affective and psychological power of it. Because we were there and we were planning to go and be part of the delegation that welcomes him at the airport. And out of the blue, you know, people on the ground have been organizing for this. I'm not one of those people. I wasn't in Lebanon in organizing, but they've been organizing for weeks after learning that he was going to be released. And so I was coordinating with comrades around what time and what day. And he was supposed to come on a Saturday, and there were all the plans to do that. And then all of a sudden on Friday, they get word through his brother and sister that he's already on a plane, right? And so you can see how the Lebanese government, in coordination with the former colonizer, is working to derail mass movements and to have people come to the airport and have a showing. And I think part of that is because of what's happening, certainly in terms of disarmament, and we can talk about that, but also how governments and oppressive regimes work together to make sure that we don't have signs of resistance, that the only thing that they would like us to believe is that all of this is a fait accompli, that it doesn't matter, that everybody has forgotten him, right? And so that's a psyops also for him, that all of a sudden 41 years later, look, there's no, you know, welcome party here. Your party has left you. This revolutionary, you know, fervor is in the past. All of that comes together. Of course, that didn't happen. People dropped everything and showed up. And despite all the measures of like not allowing people into the airport, not allowing journalists into the airport, there were all these sorts of things. And it was a fucking hot, hot day in Beirut. And people were out there for hours. And people were out there with Hezbollah flags. People were out there with Communist Party flags. People were out there with Lebanese Communist Party flags. And there was a mass array of folks saying, you know, all your machinations to sort of disrupt our ability to show up is not going to work. And I think he had the welcome that he deserved. And I think he came out, you know, swinging for us all. And it was so moving. I was getting ready actually for my brother's wedding and watching his speech at the same time. So I was sitting there. There's like this, you know, interesting contrast of what was happening, but also just such a fabric of life in the context of the United States. I mean, it's in the context of Lebanon.
Yeah, appreciate it. I mean, we should say a little bit about how he comes out and the statements that he makes. And I mean, I think, and this is something I think that you hear from a lot of political prisoners, is that, I mean, 4 decades, like, you know, this is almost my entire life,
Yes.
you know, and Mumia is actually like one who, I think he was arrested something like 5 or 6 days after I was born. So it's like basically my entire life. And, you know, you talk to some of the folks that do end up making it out. And one of the questions that people ask them is like, well, how did you like stay sane? Like, how did you
Yeah.
make it through? Especially because a lot of these folks end up in solitary confinement for a very long time, because that's how they deal with political prisoners, is they want to isolate them from other folks so that they can isolate their ideas and make sure that they're not spreading their kind of revolutionary, you know, knowledge, which, you know, at a certain phase, I mean, both Lenin, but also George Jackson and others, like they really thought about prisons as like revolutionary cadre schools kind of thing. And because obviously the conditions are such that people are ripe for that type of revolutionary political knowledge, but it has to be contained, you know, by the state.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you hear from these folks, right, is like, so how do you make it through when you're dealing with being in a 6x8 cell or something like that? And they talk about how important it is to like, to just hold on firm to
Yeah.
your political commitments and principles, and understand, and like that grounding really becomes a way that they can stay sane, you know, in that
Mm-hmm.
setting. And I mean that quite literally, right?
Yeah.
Because people do go mad because
That's the intent.
it's the intent, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it is it's a mental torture that they're
Yes.
trying to put people in to isolate human beings from even another person, which could give them some recognition that you're alive, you're a human
Yeah.
being, right? Which I don't think it's very hard for us to. I think it was Ray Luc Levasseur who once said to me, like, if you want to try to imagine it, like, put yourself in your bathroom and just sit in the bathtub and try to sit there for like days.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and like that, you know, he's like, that's the closest I could give somebody to, you know, approximating what the experience is like. It's still not quite the same, but
Yeah.
So anyways, all that is preamble to say he comes out and his politics are like rock solid, and he's saying all the things that of course the state doesn't want him to be saying right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
So yes,
Yeah.
what are some of your reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that's most powerful about him is any photo or any interview you had of him while he was incarcerated is also, you know, in a tiny room full of books with Che's photo on the wall and a kufi. So, I mean, he was unbending and remains unbending. It's the clearest example I have of psychic militancy. And it's not by chance. You and I have talked about this before. It's not by chance that political prisoners are the ones who have so much to teach us about psychic militancy. Obviously, I'm in the throes of the book. So I've been sort of working with material around Walid Daqqa and his idea of searing consciousness and talking about the ways in which the intention is to find its way into the psyche, not just to intrude, but to kind of reconfigure it entirely. And I think that the ways to resist that and refuse are tied to a militant struggle. It's not an individualistic, even though they are in solitary confinement, which the point is to atomize them and make them individuals, right? Yes, it is to separate them and not have them have contagion effect and all the things we know. And also, it's about breaking ties to a collective, breaking ties to a fabric, letting the sort of collective cause atrophy. And so part of the resistance and refusal is also to become an individual and to refuse to believe the lies, which we know they told him, that people have forgotten about him. So he comes out and immediately it's about Gaza. Right? People are sort of really excited to see him and are asking about how he is. And he says, and I love listening to it in Arabic because he has such a beautiful way with Arabic. It's just so gorgeous and so moving and so grounded. But he comes out and he was just like, we'll talk about that. He's like so tender too. He tries not to shame even the most ridiculous, liberal, and sometimes antagonistic questions that journalists, and I'm going to put that very loosely, are asking him. And so he redirects them and he was just like, we'll talk about that later, Habibi. Right now, we need to talk about Gaza. Right now, we need to understand what's happening there. Right now, I call on all my Arab siblings. And he comes out and he has a special shout out and really a sort of taking to task of Egypt and says, everybody needs to be on the streets. Everybody needs to be really actually storming the border and liberating our siblings. We need to do that. And he kind of repeats this thing of, you know, Greta Thunberg coming. And if this little girl can, you know, this little pint-sized person can come and sort of show support, why aren't we doing that? And I didn't understand it in a shaming way. I understand that as a reminder of where our focus needs to be, and a reminder that this is where his mind and soul and every breath has been, that he has been tracking this, that he's deeply disturbed by it. And let's remember, it's also what he was in prison for, right? Like Georges Abdallah has been committed to the cause of the liberation of Palestine, and that's why he was imprisoned. And so in many ways, there's also this way that feels so enlivening that here he is being released into a world that has taken up the cause that at that point he was taking a massive risk and among a few people who are willing to do this. Now, certainly in the context of Lebanon, there's a long history of Palestinian and Lebanese resistance together. And I think that's the other thing that the Lebanese state specifically has been trying to erase from our memory and atomize us and dislodge us from the histories of struggle. Georges Abdallah is our reminder that there wasn't a separation between Lebanon and Palestine in terms of the resistance, because our resistance is against the same forces of imperialism, colonialism, and settler colonialism, and Zionist oppression. And so he comes out into this world, and I saw a clip of him. I watch everything that I can that he's saying, where he's talking about the Kufi and talking about our guide and talking about how Palestine remains the focus of our struggle, and that effectively, he doesn't say these words, but this is a shorthand for us, that our liberation runs through Jerusalem. And it's the liberation of the Arabs specifically, and he's not let go of that, right? The other thing he comes out and says is, I'm pro-resistance. And anybody who's thinking that you can't be pro-resistance right now is doing the work of counterinsurgency, is doing the work of empire, is doing the work of colonialism, is doing the work of sectarianism. And his analysis is spot on, you know. My dad actually went to visit him this weekend. And part of this is he has like an open door policy around whoever wants to come visit him and talk with him. And I was talking to my Baba, and I was asking him, like, how does he see him? And he sent me a photo, of course. And he's just like, he's sharp as fuck. You know, he's warm and loving. And my dad, who's like not the most emotionally attuned person in the world, was able to say, like, it felt like he had been deprived of affect and closeness, which is true. But how that translated was a closeness and like hugging and being tender, but also completely aware and sharp and on point in terms of what's ahead and what needs to be done and what our focus needs to be.
I love that point, because I think this is something I've experienced with people who've been incarcerated or are incarcerated that I know, and have built relationships with, is that kind of, you know, and Orasami Barton has talked about it he has a piece on Black masculine care work, but just this, like, yeah, that I think that it's really interesting the way you framed that around his the warmth and the closeness and the kind of comfort with like hugging and stuff like that a lot of men are kind of awkward around with each other because of our, you know, messed up masculinity and stuff like that, you know. And so yeah, that's interesting to think about in that context as well. So let's talk a little bit about, I mean, the big, aside from George Abdullah's release, the big thing that's going on in Lebanon right now is that the United States and Israel are trying to force the Lebanese state to disarm its resistance groups. I mean, and this is so wild too, because obviously, like, Israel has violated that ceasefire like every single day since it was inked, which is of course not surprising because that's what Israel does.
Yes.
But and it's not as though the Lebanese, you know, it's not as though Hezbollah or the resistance didn't know that Israel would violate the ceasefire too. But you know, these are agreements that go into place, and certainly it's not the same intensity as it was, you know, when they were exchanging, you know, missiles every day and that kind of stuff. But as all this is happening, I mean, one of the big shifts, of course, regionally is the Jolani, you know, the HTS government in Syria, right? And so, as folks had talked about a lot, like whatever people thought about Assad, and you know, we're not here to like say, oh, great guy, right? That's not what we're saying. But there was an ability, right, of a resistance flow between Iran and Hezbollah. And of course, their relationship goes all the way back to
Yeah.
the Iran-Iraq War, which was sponsored by both the West and like the Soviet Union against Iran post its revolution. And so and of course Hezbollah has this long resistance in Lebanon. I mean, they are the group that is responsible for the expulsion of the Israeli occupation in the south,
Mhm.
right? Which is this huge turning point. It's also a point that the Palestinian resistance very much looked to as an example potentially for Gaza, right? And so there's a lot there that's really rich and important in terms of the history.
Mhm.
And now you're in a situation where there are demands on Syria, right? Of, hey, if you all really want to normalize and really want to, be able to get sanctions lifted and, you know, some type of development and welcome, be whatever, some form of normalization with Israel, but more importantly, to get the West's support, I think. Um, that maybe you are going to need to go in and invade Lebanon and take out the resistance forces there, or Lebanese state, you need to disarm them, right?
Mhm.
So like there's this kind of bind going on now where the West is placing demands on both this, just say, the Syrian government and the Lebanese government
Yeah.
to hem in and take out this resistance force.
Yeah.
Either they voluntarily just give up their arms, or through potentially a threat of another war, and perhaps Israel would be involved in that too, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so I we know that the state made a decision to say, okay, you do have to disarm. Um, I'm interested in one, like how that seemed to be read to you by people in Lebanon. Like, what was the mood of? I mean, I know there's a lot of different people and a lot of different groups and things like that, but like, how was that being read, and sort of how do you read the situation right now?
Yeah. Yeah. A very small question for for Lebanon and its history. But let me just start with like that this is a long story and has been going on for a long time. And I say that because I think, again, the intent of certainly imperialism and settler colonialism and all that is to dislodge us from histories and think about every single moment as a standalone moment and forget, what it comes in. We see this with Tofan al-Aqsa, of course, where like there's a temporal stamp and it's like, oh, everything starts here. That's not by chance. The same thing is happening here. So if we can think about the impulse and expansionist project of empire in the region, in our region, for the past 2+ decades, it, that Lebanon has always been in the crosshairs of this. And certainly there have been ebbs and flows of like the intensity of it and how outward it is and how obvious it is. But it's not a new story. Now, what happens in Lebanon, of course, in the past 5 years specifically, is you have an intifada that starts, then COVID hits, then you have the port blast, then you have its currency, like it was like, it is unbelievable. Everybody lost their money. So it's thing upon thing upon thing upon thing, where like this myth of the phoenix of Beirut is like, there's no fucking phoenix. It's just, it's just ash and it's on the ground. And I think this creates a space where, of course, you can mobilize already existing fault lines that really come to a head when people are suffering. Then you have Syria and refugee of 3 million refugees in Lebanon, right? Which we need to be taking care of our siblings. But Lebanon's really small. Just as a comparison, the United States took 20,000 refugees. Lebanon took 3 million. And again, as a Lebanese person, I'm like, you're right next door. That's your fucking responsibility. So I'm not just like, but for a state whose infrastructure is purposefully degraded, this you can start to see, it's like, doesn't take much to see what starts to happen on the level of a population that has no money to eat, no money to survive, And then you have sectarianism over top of it, mobilizing targets and saying that's your target. So that's the backdrop of it. And this is where the ceasefire comes in, and why it's a long story is that the settler state has never respected the sovereignty of its neighboring countries. In the context of Lebanon, yes, of course, the ceasefire, and this is the sort of heartbreaking thing about Lebanon. It's a small country, but there's a way in which the South is made to exist in isolation. So when I'm in Lebanon, no matter how small it is, and I'm in the mountains where I'm from, I do not hear the bombing. I know it is happening every single day. It is happening every single day, and it's happening with ferociousness. And people are still getting killed, and people's land and livelihoods are being stolen from them. But you could live without any knowledge of that. So, but breaking, my entire life has been living in the context of a country in which, you'd be walking on, college campus, and the Israelis break the sound barrier over you. It's a constant reminder that they're watching you. I sent you a video of the drones that we were in Beirut, and you just hear a drone over top of you, and you hear warplanes, and like this is the field in which all of this exists. And it has to be said like that, because nothing can be understood about what's happening without recognizing that that's the backdrop that's constantly there, and why resistance is important, why the question of disarmament is a travesty. When you have these casual, it's like normalized. It's so normalized that people are sitting there wondering, this has been my entire life, but still now, of like distinguishing, was that a bomb? Was that a fighter jet? Was that breaking the sound barrier? We were in Baalbek, right actually the day of when they attacked people and assassinated somebody. And they did break the sound barrier. And you were just like, that sounded like a bomb or breaking the sound barrier. And so you're constantly and that becomes a normal part of the fabric of life of being Lebanese. So that's just a sort of, let's pinpoint where this comes from. From there, I think one of the things to really understand also for me that I saw is that, yes, there is the machinations of empire, and that is always there. And also the ways in which these systems work hand in hand with what is blatantly anti-Shia sentiment. This is fundamentally at the heart of disarmament of Hezbollah is anti-Shia sentiment. Because if you really were to break it down logically, Hezbollah, in terms of its ability and capacity and all these sorts of things, and I hate to go down these routes, but sometimes they need to be said. If they really were interested in taking over the fucking country, they could do it in a heartbeat, and all of us would just be sitting there. They've shown the capacity to do that. They brought the Zionist settler state and their proxies to their knees several times. That's not their interest. And so for me, when I'm looking at an analytic here, it's important for us also to say, at the heart of this is anti-Shia sentiment. There's a global anti-Shia sentiment that comes into this. And then Hezbollah becomes sort of a representative, which is why it's easy to mobilize this, because it's an infrastructure that already exists. You don't have to do very much in the imaginary of people, both in terms of outside of Lebanon, but also in Lebanon, right? To mobilize this anti-Shia sentiment, to talk about numbers and, demographic threat, all the same racist shit that you hear in the context of this settler colony is mobilized and articulated in that way with just a different locale, right? And different specificities. So you are hearing all of that in the context of Lebanon. On one hand, it felt affectively like it was a powder keg. Like you could feel the tension. People are angry as fuck. You see it, you feel it. And then you have all these sort of warring components. The thing that struck me the most is when you land in Lebanon, you land in what, is pejoratively called Hezbollah territory, right? So it's right outside Dahi, and you sort of have to drive past Dahi out. Now, not only do you see some of the wreckage, right? But also one of the things that I realized is when we landed, there was almost no trace of Sayyid Nasrallah. There were no photos, there were no banners, there were very few, very, 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 very few. And that is shocking. And so when I was asking folks and comrades, like, what's up with that? Because that is usually a space where, like, there's no, that's not a question. That's what I was expecting. In other parts of the country, you know, up north, I'm not expecting photos of Sayyid Nasrallah. But there, I was certainly saying there wasn't anything there. And the answer was, that's the government. Every time somebody puts something up, they take it down. So you can start to see the infrastructure that's already been laid to move into this moment. This is not a moment that comes out of nowhere or out of a vacuum, which also matches, by the way, the construction of the second largest consulate in the world, which is really a base, which is really a surveillance. It's a United States base and surveillance space. So all of this, the infrastructure has been leading up to this moment. And I think there's a capitalizing on all these different elements that I'm talking about. And you can feel all of that. There's like nothing of this that isn't obvious to anybody who's sort of clued in many ways. The last thing I'll say is that there's still a lot of people that are pro-resistance. And that's the thing to remember, because people want to sort of make it seem like Lebanese exceptionalism and, oh, we just want to be done with this and we just want peace and we just want to be able to go eat and go to the beach and all this sort of shit. And it's just like, no, there's a lot of people that are fucking pro-resistance. And there's a lot of people that are pro-resistance because their lives, their livelihoods, and those of their siblings have been implicated by the violence of Zionism and the violence of imperialism. And they get that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that stands out to me, just as somebody who's not there, but it's just like, I mean, what do people think will happen if Hezbollah is disarmed? Like, do they actually think that this is going to lead Israel, which in this moment keeps, even, even you have Netanyahu and, they're all talking in this moment about greater Israel, about Eretz Israel, about this notion of, again, settler colonialism, of the kind of Israeli manifest destiny, as Nick Estes recently did a really good, I thought, piece on, talking about U.S. manifest destiny as very much our Zionism, our kind of in this settler colony. But so there's a kind of like, there's a bind, I understand on some level. I mean, I also do empathize with people who would like to have their lives go back to normal. I mean, I've talked about this with Abdul Jawad quite a bit, and obviously he's talking to people in Gaza a lot. I exchange messages with people in Gaza a lot. Of course, there is this very human desire that is quite easily to and we're going to get to emotional, the connection between warfare and emotions later on, but like, it is quite an easy thing to kind of do psyops and psychological warfare around, because people will have a natural inclination to, war is hell, and we want it to stop, and we would like to be able, also, as you mentioned, the kind of economic the ways that, to go back to like Samir Amin, all these ways that the imperial core has of throttling the economies of the periphery. And that is its own form of warfare that people do not have a good sense of at all living within the core. But people who live in the periphery, they all have understandings of this because they've all experienced it, and maybe they haven't studied it from a kind of Samir Amin lens, but they've experienced the effects of it, and they want, again, those effects. Like, can we do something to alleviate this so that I can have money to buy something? Because right now the money I make is worth nothing. So I'm deeply empathetic, sympathetic to all of those feelings. At the same time, there is this real reality of the fact that I don't think that, I mean, even who knows what the Zionist entity will do, but I think it's very foolish for any state in its arena to be disarming its own resistance forces, especially because none of these governments seem willing to use their armies to defend or fight, right? And so, I mean, in that instance, you could actually make an argument from a state sort of centric, of like, hey, we want the state monopoly on violence, but we will defend our, but they're not doing that. I mean, I know this is getting into frameworks that neither one of us love, but the point is just that why that seems very short-sighted on behalf of the Lebanese state. But I think it also, you've talked about this maybe before too, it also dovetails with some of their own interests at the high level. So yeah.
Yeah, at a class level, right? At a class level, at their aspirations, at their what they imagine to be. Just a couple things is one, if we're talking about, and you're right, you and I, thinking about these things is not exactly our favorite thing, but let's take hypothetically, and this goes back to anti-Shia stuff, right? That the Lebanese state is sort of putting itself, there was the communique that came out today, and the president was just like, we weren't threatened, but it was sort of like, if we don't do this, we're no longer a concern to the United States. Okay, that's fucking coercion, and we know what that means, right? So enough with this bullshit. But I think here's the thing, is it's presented as though, oh, we only have these two options, poor us, we either disarm or we're selling ourselves to being thrown into the bin of history because our fucking colonial benefactors aren't paying attention to us, right?
I just want to say too quickly, like, this is the story of Libya also. Like, Libya was like, it collaborated after 9/11 with, like, the anti-terrorism stuff. And then they went to Gaddafi and they said, hey, you got to give away your WMDs. And he did. And they overthrew the state,
You
like,
don't
so like
make
this.
a deal with the
Yeah.
fucking devil. who does not have any rules, who talk about monopoly on violence. You're exactly right. Like, whether it's the Zionist settler state, or which is a proxy of the United States, we know it plays dirty. So all this shit is bullshit. But the way it's presented is, oh, we only have these options. But let's take a hypothetical here, and then I could talk about sort of like people feeling like they want life to go back to normal. Is that fundamentally the best possible thing that the Lebanese government could do, if it wanted to neutralize, is have all Hezbollah fighters become part of the fucking military. The Lebanese military is bullshit. They're nothing. They're capable of nothing. They do nothing. Their capacity is degraded on purpose. They're not allowed any access to weapons or arms or training or any one of these things, despite the fact that they are used by American empire. There's also a way in which they are very much a client state and sort of kept in their place, right? So, but that is one thing you could do. You have war-ready fighters who have more experience than all of you combined, including your high-ranking people. That is one thing you could do and neutralize them. Then they become the defense of the state and not your sort of militant by itself, which is everything they do. But here's where anti-Shia racism comes in, is that fundamentally, that would never be considered, because I think on a visceral level, people have a difficulty believing that Shia, particularly those who are affiliated with Hezbollah, would actually defend the country rather than themselves. And if we follow the logic of racism, it's a similar story of like dual loyalties and all that sort of thing. I mean, that's one component of it. There's a lot of other stuff, right? Including the fact that the United States would never let that happen. Could you imagine having an actual force, a counter force that is legitimized against the settler state? That, they would never let that happen. But that's a hypothetical. And for us, that's an important exercise for us to do, because it's always presented as this impossible choice, right? Oh, look at us, poor us. We have to make this decision. Let's disarm because this is better for our future. We know that's not the way it goes, like you were saying. But the impossible choice is also done on a popular level. This idea of people feeling like, I just want life to get back to normal. Number one is the sort of internalized belief that there is a normal to go back to, both in terms of the past, but also what is to come when you make a deal with American empire. Like, there's nothing good that can come out of that, but there is a way in which, when you put people in such, like you were saying, the things that oftentimes are missed about how utterly bankrupt the entire system is and how people are really struggling. I mean, people's salaries went, let's say, people who are making $1,000 a month, which is still nothing if you're, if you're trying to raise a family, went down to making $10 a month. And the prices stayed the same. It's not like they changed. So there is this way in which those conditions create impossible choices where people feel coerced into siding with certain decisions because of the magical thinking that comes with them, right? So I'm in a cab, like anywhere in the global south, and I strike up a conversation with the cab. And on the one hand, I can just get from how he's saying it that he's pro-resistance. On the other hand, he starts along this line saying, in the end, fuck all these leaders, and we just want anybody who comes to rule us, just let them come to rule us so that we can eat bread, so that we have enough money to feed our families, right? And that sort of like you say, I don't begrudge people that. I'm coming in with an analytic and like getting into a cab and having this conversation, but this is people's everyday life. And the thing that I also realize is one of the things, Beirut is sort of known there for having all these old taxi cabs, right? And they're like really old Mercedes taxi cabs, and they're everywhere, and they're called service, and you can get in, and it was like really cheap to do that when I was a student. Now, we're talking 20 years ago here. But the first thing that I noticed is that there were so few of them in the road. You used to trip over them because this is kind of the bustling city, Beirut. And so I asked him also, I was just like, I couldn't find a cab to save my life. What's going on? And he was just like, and this is where you get really humbled by people's like everydayness and the mundane. And he was like, well, we don't have money to drive around with gas. So like all of it becomes private cabs that people call because they're insured that trip will be paid for, versus it used to be that you could drive around and make sure you could pick up somebody and you'd make up for it. But now no one has money for gas. So that's what I mean about like impossible choices matched with magical thinking about who's going to save us from this, because the conditions have become so dire that it's impossible for us to think of any other choices. Now, I think this is where movements have a place to, play, where grassroots efforts, I did hear from a lot of folks that there's a lot of autonomous sort of grassroots efforts that are coming out. Unfortunately, the Communist Party is not really doing much of anything, but like the counterforce needs to be something that people can sort of invest that same sort of psychic and affective power into. Otherwise, of course, they're going to feel demobilized and demoralized and despairing, because that's precisely the channels through which empire can exact its course and make people think that they are actually welcoming saviors. That when the United States gets boots on the ground, that there's a savior here, and that at least we have a chance. I think there are many people, by the way, by and large, that understand the evils of the United States. People aren't stupid. They have an analysis. They understand. But we say in Arabic, badun al-khalsa, they just want to finish with it. And so they're just sort of like, let me take this gamble because this one here hasn't worked. Whereas like, I'm just like, where your fucking leaders live. And like, let's start there.
Yeah, it's funny, we did this study group on Samir Amin's accumulation on a world scale, and I'm glad that we did it as a study group, because I would never be able to read more than like 10 pages of that book if I wasn't reading it with other people to talk about, because it's just like dry third world economics through his like, he comes from a Marxist and a Leninist line, but he has his own, kind of adoption of it and fitting to the situations of the global South or the periphery. And, that book, it shows a lot of things, and obviously things have shifted because of it was written in like the 60s. And so there's a lot that's changed, but a lot is the same in terms of the overall dynamics. And he basically just goes through all this stuff of like, well, if you think states could try this, well, they've done this, and this is the response that empire has. And and so it's like all of this stuff, and it's not a it's not a nihilistic or a defeatist text. Like, he does have some ideas, and he would elaborate them later in a lot of his other work about things that states in the global south should do. Primarily, like, one of them is his concept around delinking. But that this what he's saying is, it's just sort of like these states get in this position, and they cycle through all of these things that they can try, but there's ultimately, it is like this question of politics and power relations, that they're hemmed in. And so, thinking that my only point in this is just saying that I think states in the global south, and it's easy for me to say this as somebody in the imperial core who does not have to make these decisions or live with them, but thinking that you can just capitulate to the demands, and that will be enough, and that will is just not, especially when you're in a situation where, like, just geostrategically, I mean, Israel wants Lebanon, and also for the West, like, it's in that area where it's kind of in similar to Israel, or really to Palestine, I should say, but similar to that whole region is the kind of bridge, right, between Asia, Africa, and Europe, right? And so when you think about all of their machinations and concerns about, immigration, as the climate crisis continues to get worse, or as the quality of life in the global south continues to get worse, as capitalism declines, like all of these things, it is strategically situated in a place where they'll never be able to have some kind of sovereignty outside of what they can build for themselves, aligning with other people in the region and with popular forces, so yeah.
Absolutely. And to think about the timing of it, right? I mean, this is part of like the timing of it is one of the things that's often left out as they're talking about disarmament, disarmament, disarmament. But at the same time, we know that the United States has been arming right-wing Christian militias. And, Lebanon is a heavily armed place and has been for a very long time. But what are the sort of forces that have been shored up? So it's the same fucking tired story of the United States being like, oh, we care about disarming these people, but at the same time, they're shoring up the capacity of other militias that they can mobilize when they want to, whether it's through a civil war or through a counter force that happens, or through forcing a confrontation, or whatever the case might be. So that's happening. At the other hand, it's deeply disturbing and needs to be said that at the time that Daesh, ISIS, is making incursions into Lebanon, and has on several times, and they found like a weapon depot even close to where my family lives, which is really far and very bizarre. And people were really, that creeped people out. They were just like, oh, what the fuck? Like, this is not far away. There's nothing quite like in your backyard to make people be like, oh shit, this is happening. Like, the timing of it, when Daesh is making incursions that you're disarming the only counterforce that you have against this. And like, that's what we need to know. What has become clear over the past 2 years is something that people, I'm not the first person to say this, it's not a conspiracy theory. We know how the United States works and who it arms and who it doesn't, right? And that Daesh is supported by the United States, weirdly offline for fucking 2 years as they care about the Muslim Ummah and protecting Islam, that we don't fucking hear a goddamn thing from you. I'm not saying I want to, by the way, right? Like, let's make it clear what I'm saying here. But
No, but you're right. It's like the weirdest like, ISIS is the weirdest thing in the world.
yeah.
I mean, I've always sort of like, Cena will just be like, ISIS is a U.S. proxy. Like, let me say this again. ISIS is a U.S.
Yeah.
proxy. But like the reality is that if you ever try to figure out like who are these people, where do they get armed, like what is the how is this, like it your only conclusion can kind of be that it's like either
Totally.
Israel or the United States are somehow behind it. I mean, it's
Totally.
just so weird.
Because even in ideological coherence, like you could totally come on the scene and be like, we're protecting Islam, but completely, you know, in a predatory way, which they are. They're fascists, right? But like, what? There's fucking nothing. But so the timing of it, all these sorts of things at the same time are happening, and it's a serious threat in Lebanon. And then, of course, there's the added thing about the Druze and the Druze in not only in the Jelan, but in Sueda and in Syria. And this is the complexity that we're walking into. And I often, I kind of bristle at that word sometimes because it's often used to like explain actually very simple things, right? Like, oh, settler colonialism in Palestine is so complex. No, it's fucking not. You have an invading, sort of settler colonial force and Europeans that settle the fucking land, and they're committing genocide and have been since 1948 and prior to that. That is not complex. But when you see all these moving pieces, the complexity where it comes from is that they tie us up in certain ways so that we can lose sight of the actual underlying logic beneath it and what sort of systems is it shoring up, and in enticing people into these sorts of magical thinking and all that, you're conscripting people into that, right? And like, we were there and Stephen kept reminding, I was fucking so angry. I was so angry. I was so angry that I was so close to Palestine, but felt so far away. I was so angry that I didn't see more graffiti, more Palestinian flags, more kufiyas. And I was seething. I was seething, and I felt so, on the one hand, nourished to be in that space that I felt was mine, where I could fight my people, because like that's what I need to do. That's my responsibility. And then Stephen would remind me, like, the state gives heavy consequences to people who are here, and that they're disappeared and they're tortured and they're thrown into fucking prison and they don't, see the light of day, and they have to feed their families. Like, so I really work to hold on to all of that. I still don't think that's a replacement for the duties we have to the world, and for us to remain clear on the surety of what our future will be if we don't resist the expansionist project of the Zionist state and the empire. Like, that's the sure thing. Everything else could emerge, and hopefully through struggle. This is our project, is through struggle you work this stuff out. But there's one sure thing that we've seen from every example in the world, and that's the part I want people to sort of constantly be in the process of fighting against and dislodging from themselves, right? Like you were saying, like the belief that somehow this is going to go anywhere good.
Yeah, appreciate all of that. The only thing that I would just echo is you mentioned very early on of like if Hezbollah had wanted to take over the state, like it could have. And it's interesting. I never finished all of Amal Saad's book on Hezbollah, but it's very good. And she actually talks, and this was written, I can't remember, oh five maybe, somewhere in the 2000s. But she deals with this question, because there is this whole question of, obviously you have the Islamic Republic, do they want to establish a Shia, caliphate, right? This is the kind of discussion that comes up. And Nasrallah was always like very, very clear on this. And Hezbollah, like doctrinally, was that, basically they would never establish anything that was undemocratic, essentially. So they do not believe in any form of government or governance that is against the will of the people. And I think that that is something that is really interesting. I mean, it's also dovetails to me with questions that I've had with Abdul Jawad over the years about now. Well, I guess it is over the years now, um, uh, about Hamas as well, too, as like, and I know they're not Shia, but that their vision of Islamic governance is not like is not a totalizing one, or one in which there is no separation between a kind of civil life, civil society, right, and the religious world, basically. And I just think that I know that I'm not an expert on any of that stuff, but I think it's important to kind of just say for people in the West, because there is all in our brains and how we are propagandized around these things. I mean, even from, of course, like people like Netanyahu, or certainly our own state, right? Of looking at all forms of quote unquote Islamism as having the same or a very similar vision of what Islamic State or Islamic governance style looks like, and seeing that as like very repressive, very punitive, very um, against, whatever, like different expressions of how people want to be, and all this kind of stuff. Um, and I just wanted to say that, because that is also something that I read within her book, was just talking about how actually Hezbollah has always been quite open in terms of understanding that in Lebanon, it is a state that has all different kinds of people with different belief systems, and they can't impose their belief system upon everyone else.
And really, it's a confession of empire and settler colonialism to think that the only way of governance would be through domination and forcing people. I mean, this is what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now. This is why I hate those memes or whatever when they're like, this is not Afghanistan, this is the United States. I'm like, no, it's fucking the United States. You don't need that reference point, right? You don't need to reference when this is what's happening here. So in some ways, that racist fantasy, that racist imaginary is part and parcel of like somehow thinking that these, people are the only thing they can think about is domination and takeover. Like that sounds like something very specific, and that's empire and that's fascism. That's the only thing they can see. Whereas really, Hezbollah specifically has an incredibly sophisticated governance model and a reminder that they were part of the parliament. Which is what a lot of people on the ground, I think, were talking about. If we're thinking about strategies, about what held them back a lot in terms of actually joining the resistance in the full force that they had. They took time precisely because they were very circumspect about dragging, quote unquote, Lebanon into the mix. Many of us were just like, that's not dragging this is the whole country's sovereignty. This is not just the South, as though it's a separate country unto itself, which is how it's often articulated or narrated. But that is really that's the truth telling for us to think about, is that there's always this calculation about what it's going to be like, how people are going to respond, how demonized are they going to be, even more so than, and we see, of course, that if you track it, there's no possible way they could have moved that was going to relieve the people who are racist and anti-Hezbollah and anti-resistance and pro-normalization. There's no version of what Hezbollah could do that was going to relieve them of that, right? In 2006, they fucking kicked the ass of the Zionist entity. In 2000, they fucking kicked them out. And you still have people be like, oh, what's the point of having a resistance force in the context of Lebanon? When, by the way, Lebanon is still occupied. Right now, they're fucking occupying Lebanon. That's why you need a resistance force, especially if the state's not going to step in and fucking do anything about the fact that there's an occupying force in your country. So I think there's this way, again, for us to be like, why does this narrative take hold? It's because there's this projection about what this looks like. And really, what would it mean to be like, oh, there's a force that's actually interested in the benefit of the state? Now, this is where my issue comes in, then, and I often say that, it's like we liberate Palestine and we liberate Lebanon. And for me, when you liberate Palestine, you liberate the Arab world. And then a whole new host of shit comes up, and we'll get there when we get there, in terms of nationalism and sort of like borders. And I don't believe in any of that. But right now, the question is of an occupying force in a settler colonial state that does not respect, the sovereignty of its neighbors. That's why we're having this question right now. And so that's the honesty right now for us to be focusing on, rather than these sort of larger questions that we have. The final thing that I'll say is that every person who's a member of Hezbollah, and Sayyid Nasrallah himself, is Lebanese. They fought for their fucking country. And that feels like such a simple statement, but it's so devastating to have people steal that from them. Like, they gave up so much. He was murdered for his fucking country. We were at the airport waiting for our comrades to come visit us, and there was a woman next to me waiting, and she was just telling me about how her son-in-law was martyred, about how her nephew was martyred, about how they went back and found their home completely gone, how they set up a tent, and then the state came and made them take away the tent. And like, all I could do is say to her, like, we're behind you, and this is not for naught, and that we recognize the sacrifices that you've made. And nationalism or not, like, the sacrifices are for their fucking country. And that's the piece. Like, don't steal that from people.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I yeah, I mean, I have mountains of respect for all of those people, and I mean, I miss Hassan Nasrallah. Like, I don't, I miss his words and his speeches, and I'm not ashamed to say that, and I think that uh, yeah, I mean, there's an incredible amount of sacrifice, and I mean, the thing about it, right, is like there's a way that we can look at the resistance forces that exist and sort of somehow, want that they could have done more or whatever else. And it's like, man, if the whole world just had the conscience and the fortitude and the, moral clarity to respond in the ways that the axis of resistance did to this unfolding Holocaust, then we wouldn't be where we are right now, with our, timelines full of starving Palestinians in Gaza who are just begging to get, not, I don't want to say begging, because it takes away the humanity of these people. They're just reaching out, right, and asking people to spread their words and see if they can contribute in the situation where they just have nothing and they're being displaced again, and it's under a basically full media blackout that this is happening. And if there were more people as brave and heroic as the resistances in the region, then we wouldn't be in this place. And and as organized, honestly, right? Like, that's the other part of it, is that these are groups that organize themselves over years, over decades in some instances. And there's a lot to, I think, to learn and to take away from that. um I want to shift. I mean, one way that we can shift a little bit and talk a little bit about Gaza some more, because I realize it's been a while since we talked. A lot has sort of happened in that, in the center of this genocide. Um, and one of the things that we talked about this, was this woman, Jennifer Counter. I'll pull up her lovely screed. So she wrote this piece, Rules of Offensive Influence, which is a kind of, I would describe it as like a summarized psyop manual is basically the way I would describe it. It's
Mhm.
not like, I should say before I start talking about it, I mean, and I did a whole live stream on it. So if you missed it, I'm not going to go into it, the detail that I did on that
Definitely watch it,
here.
folks.
But, one of the things to say is that, and she does say this actually at the beginning, she's like, there's no new ideas under the sun. I mean, one of the things I find funny about the document is she sources nothing in it, yet all of it is clearly just lifted from years of like psyop manuals and, um, you know, different texts on how to do psychological operations and this kind of stuff. And of course, she poses herself as like a strategic communications. Um, I'm gonna pull this back up for a second. Oh, that's not the right one. There we go. So she's a vice president at Orbis Operations, which I don't think she's there anymore because she's now with, what is it? SGS, FSS? What is it? Safe. Let me just get this right so I don't.
She's too
Uh,
busy aiding genocide that she hasn't
well,
updated her LinkedIn.
that that's right. I mean, this is the funny thing about it, right? Is that there are these like, in the intelligence world, in the world of these types of figures, like suddenly new corporations just show up, right? And
Mhm.
then a new aid organization shows up and nobody knows how it's funded. It's not actually registered anywhere, but somehow it has mercenaries in Gaza distributing aid and shooting at Palestinians every day on tourist visas, as we now know, thanks to the whistleblower Aguilar. And so this woman is somebody who works for one of the I'll just say this, like one of the contractors that's related to this project. And she also works at Columbia University, where of course they've been repressing the shit out of pro-Palestine students, which I still think is insane because it is just like a finishing school
Yes.
for the elite, and that they've just
They'll cannibalize themselves.
cannibalizing all of these
Mhm.
young folks, and I mean, I obviously full solidarity with all the students who have done, you know, great and heroic things themselves to try to resist the fascism of their own institution. But it is a wild thing that this woman's teaching there this fall on strategic communications, has this relationship with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and has this like psychological warfare text up on their website. So the point actually I wanted to bring up with you, and we can talk about anything else within it that you want to, but there was this one piece, and I think I gotta find which one it is. I mean, it's worth going through the full conversation to get some of this stuff. I mean, hope for the future is a powerful motivator. I mean, the funny thing is like the conversation that we just had and all the things about Lebanon, like, and all the ways that that it plays upon people's emotions. Like
Yes.
that's exactly what she's talking about in
Right.
all of this, is like how to effectively do that to people. Um, but where's the one about
The
the
lizard brain.
lizard brain? That's the main part I wanted
Ooh,
to
wait,
hang
what
on. Let me
number
just
was that? You sent it to me.
hang on. I'll do a
Was it like
search.
13 or something?
Yeah, hang on.
I loved when you said in that in the live stream you did that they
There we
love
go.
numbers. They love their numbers and
They
their
do. Yeah,
lists.
they think they're so
It has
smart. They're
lizard
numbered
brain.
lists. Yeah.
That's
So,
why.
anyways, so this is number 3, which is your fight is political and political fights are emotional. Though we may not want to admit it, political actions and views are often based in emotion. Often the logical part of our brain doesn't engage when emotions are involved. Identify ways to overcome the positive emotions, defensive positions, and audiences' lizard brain. At least she put it in quotes, right? But use
But she didn't
emotion to
source where it comes from.
no, use emotion to capture the audience and bring them in. So I wanted to ask you about this, deeply scientific, psychological concept of the lizard brain,
Uh-huh.
and um, and what's going on in this piece for you?
Uh, well, first of all, I think you can see that the psi disciplines more broadly have their hands all over fucking everything. And like I often I'll send you like the shit that I'm reading for this book, or have sent you that, and how like completely blatant they are. They're so honest about what they're fucking doing, right? And why they're manipulating it, and how the psyche works, and using, really psychoanalytic principles, because this is, Freud's nephew, Bernays, and all. This is a sordid history. But my favorite thing is they're so fucking honest and like just matter of fact about it. They will say the most disgusting, awful, evil, violent shit, and they're just like, this is a full force multiplier potential. Like, using the psyche will multiply the force that we can do. So she's doing a version of that, right? Is saying, just being honest. She's just like, this is what you have to do. If you want your ideology to win out, this is what you have to do. And this is the way that emotions work. And this is the way that psychology works. And like, shrug. It's sort of like being like, yeah, sorry, we won. We came and we like, sorry, we're the winners. It's the same thing. And I know you said that in a live stream, that like what she's saying, the content of what she's saying is not wrong. It's the nefarious ends that they're used to exact. And they're very honest about that.
Yeah, I mean, we probably could debate on sometimes of like how effective they are or
Yes.
not, but like the basic, and maybe she doesn't have, I mean, I don't know. I haven't studied psychology enough to know how correct she is on what works and what doesn't. But it at least several of the things that she recognizes within the piece, I think, are about like the connection between communications, psychology, winning people to your side, and these kind of things.
Yeah.
But yeah, most importantly is that she's like wants to support genocide and wants the United States and its, buddy settler colony, the Zionist entity to do this in order to win. And also has a brain that's really hard boiled on like war on terror, kind of understandings of things.
Yes, but that's exactly. And here's the thing: is like, fortunately or unfortunately, I have studied psychology. Some of the, yes, it works like that in many ways, but only if there's other infrastructure to support that. It doesn't work alone in a vacuum, and this is why, like, you and I have talked about before, about how some people talk very casually and sort of flippantly about how strong these, forces are and how they're so smart. And it's like, no, they just have access to fucking everything. So when you have an entire system built around making sure that your lizard brain can't think, this is not a fucking strategic win. This is like coercion through and through, that's built in and baked in to everything around us, from media to, I mean, most of the things you talk about on your show about, right, or the imperial 80s or 90s, and all of this sort of shit is like propaganda to make sure that these things are mobilized within us. So if we want to talk about sleeper cells, there's your fucking sleeper cells, right? These like the sort of tentacles of empire and propaganda, and then they get animated in particular ways. But this lizard brain shit comes from neuroscience, which is really sort of studying the ways in which, it's a behaviorist model of things, and it's a behavior, how affect and emotion sort of causes things. Now, it's entirely biologically deterministic. So when you are in the realm of biological determinism, you can also see how very quickly that can shift into eugenics. And that's the piece that we're talking about. Apart from the fact that it's so paternalistic and it's so devoid of any of the pieces that, like, people have their own interiority, and that people are, you know, have the capacity to think complexly, and that social relations often are at the heart of all of this. The fundamental, you know, deployment of that lizard brain tells us about the sort of like algorithm that these people are using and depending on. And that's what I mean about it has to have an entire infrastructure. You have to have an infrastructure that stops up people's ability to engage in quote unquote critical thinking, or to move against the implants that work against their best interest. And that is a life project. That is not just like, oh, we wake up and then all of a sudden our lizard brain is on. It's there. Yes, of course, we have sort of functions in our brain that are about fear and all these sorts of things. But what are the ways in which that's being exploited? And that's the part that's entirely missing when she talks like this, right? Is like, let the lizard brain work. Well, let the lizard brain work means let's activate everything that we have been working on in close proximity with the military industrial complex, with corporations, with fascists, to sort of make sure that this is the part of the brain, quote unquote. I mean, it's so ridiculous to me to talk in these ways, but that's what they're looking at. One of the things that I will say is that you've discussed this before when you're looking at the field manual, the PSYOPs field manual, is that in terms of who this works on, there's something really important that every field manual and every quote unquote Psy warrior, like they call them, work on, knows that militants are the hardest people to have this work on. People who are linked up with a cause, and they actually call them militants. They call them, you know, whether it's insurrectionists or militants or any one of these, I've seen it in many different ways, revolutionaries, that you can't turn on the lizard brain in that. That's why you actually have to use other shit. Make people hate them is what's used. The social relations are then targeted, because the whole point of being connected to a social cause, a revolutionary cause, is one in which we, number one, retain the ability to think through structures, recognize that we're always in antagonism with the enemy, and that they have all of this shit at their fingertips to be mobilized against us with that intent. The intent is to demobilize us. So there's something also, again, the honesty that's there, but also a reminder to us that this is part of kind of what I'm working on in the book, is to not have this be a foreclosed future in which we lived. We are not locked into this. And they give us kind of like the roadmap to that. They're just like, hey, if you're a militant, this is actually really hard to do. So like, be a fucking militant.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I appreciate too about Dylan Rodriguez and talking about this stuff. And he's like, look, they don't actually like when you come out and say, oh, you're doing counterinsurgency right now. Like, this is a psychological operation. It's so funny because they're so open, like you say. I mean, that's the part that does surprise people when they start reading this literature, because it's all just published and it's out there. And there's, I mean, I've had discussions with people about doing some kind of anthology and stuff like that. And I'm like, it's such a huge body of literature. It's in like there are, and Orasami Burton would say, well, yeah, but they just write the same shit over and over again. Like, they're not actually saying anything new. They're all just remixing the same thing. But it's so wild how public and how published and in various forms, and hundreds, if not thousands, probably thousands of books on this. And they just come right out and say it. And it's so funny that they do that. And then at the same time, once you confront them that, hey, I know what you're doing, right? And show others, like, this is what's going on right now in this meeting. Like, the dean is in here doing psyops right now. Like, they hate that shit, right? And a lot of the people probably who do it at that kind of level who are like in a kind of managerial or admin role at different places, they don't actually realize that that's what they're doing, because that's not the language that they've been trained around with it, which connects also to,
To
I
this
do want to
woman.
talk a little bit. What's that?
Well, that's what she's doing. She's telling
Yeah.
them how to do that. Yeah.
Right. Right. But I think like I was thinking about these conversations we've been having. Jared Ball has had a number of them, and then Renee and I and Mtume was part of it, and um uh yeah, Renee, Jared, and I and Mtume, we had these conversations with Samantha Youssef, who's this Palestinian Ukrainian animator. And it was what made me think of it, you used the term animate, but also people were talking about it in the chat, um, the links into the conversations you had on the weekend with Samantha Youssef, because
Mhm.
mass entertainment media primes us for these messages. Like, and that's one of the things that I love about the conversations with her too, is that she shares, she, I understand why she hasn't had a lot of opportunity to share her story, which is a very important story, and it's also important for her to share, because she hasn't been able to share it, and most audiences, I think she knows, wouldn't necessarily be receptive to the story in a kind of politicized way. And the thing is that she's like come to this realization of, we're Psy warriors. Like, I was trained
Yes.
to be a very effective Psy warrior, but we didn't have any of that language. They
Yes.
talked about, I think, I can't remember the exact term. She said something along the lines of emotional engagement and intellectual engagement are the
Mhm.
terms that they use. And she's talking about it in terms of the color choices, the choices that are going into the sound, the
Yes.
choices that are, and it's like, it's so powerful to hear her talk about this and how these things are constructed and layered,
Yeah.
um, in media, because it gets to, how it is that you could be in the movie theater, and I'm a sap, so like, I'll start tearing up watching
Yeah.
Freakier Friday or something like that at the end, you know and it's like, what the hell, but it's like, because they're very
Yes.
these people are brilliant at learning how to do this. And you think about that as you're talking about the infrastructure, like that's just in terms of like, blockbuster movies or whatever. But these people are all, there's so many people that are trained
Yeah.
in that kind of way. But again, they don't, to my point earlier, is like, they don't necessarily all know that. Like, they're thinking in their lane.
Yeah.
Like this woman, I think, actually knows it. Like,
Oh,
she's
yeah.
just a true believer
Yes.
in this stuff. And so
Yes.
she's like, this is how you do it.
Yes.
But a lot of people are in roles where they're a part of this in different spheres,
Yes.
but aren't actually, uh, they just think that they're doing their job to make something
Yeah.
effective or good, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, let's remember. So Bernays was a marketing expert, and there's an entire field of psychology that has gained such momentum in the last decades called industrial organizational psychology. And what they work on is, most of them end up being consultants. So that tells you enough. The second we were just like, you are consultants, you should know the type of work that's being done, which might include consulting with companies about, workforce morale, and which really translates into, how do you get more labor out of your workforce by, I don't know, setting up free food and allowing them to sleep there, and all this sort of shit that we've seen, whether it's Google or, any one of these things do. This is all due to psychology. And you are right that many people I have conversations with about who want to do industrial organizational psychology often also have this idea, like somehow the way that it's like talked about in books. And by the way, this is just another aside, that when you have to do the national licensing test for psychology, I'm a clinical psychologist, meaning my work is in the clinic. The national test you have to take is primarily biological sciences and industrial organizational psych. They have zero examples about clinical work. So that's That's a really safe world to be in, folks, where like the national licensing board test that you have to take prioritizes it, which tells you something about what the industry is producing, right? Is people who believe in quote unquote science and evidence base and industrial organizational psychology. And a lot of people will believe, oh, industrial organizational psychology means that I can go in there and I can consult with hospitals about what color the paint is so that people feel more relaxed when they're in hospital settings. Well, we can extend that and say, well, that's a really mighty fine altruistic idea, but we can imagine also the ways in which discipline and carcerality and all these things are baked into curating an environment that then mobilizes a particular affective frame so that you quote unquote feel comfortable in places you should be coming out of your skin being in. Right. And that's the part. And then, of course, what you're talking about in terms of movies is you add music, you add all these sorts of things. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that psychological warfare is at the heart of this. And then when you add capital to it, which is, again, this is not a conspiracy theory. It's not about brainwashing people. It's about maximizing intent, which often has to do with capital, which often has to do with consumerism, which often has to do with delinking people from communities, which often has to do with making sure that people are anesthetized, which has to do with their own conscription into their discipline. And you just have to see how we move at airports. Unconsciously, by the way, you don't have to do very much for us to do. And that's why I'm always interested in how do you disrupt these things? How do we constantly remain conscious of the fact that our psyches are being worked on, right? And that every space is contested space for our psyche, that there is no space that's freed up of this. Now, military psychologists are very honest about that. Many years ago, the American Psychological Association was taken to task because psychologists were involved in torture at Guantanamo Bay. The result of that was military psychologists were no longer allowed to be at torture sites. That was literally, and psychologists were like celebrating this. I'm like, could we possibly say that maybe Black sites shouldn't exist as part of our ethical commitments rather than we just can't be there? But it's not a surprise that right now they are fighting tooth and nail, and they are very close to being able to be allowed to be back on those sites, right? And that the people in Guantanamo Bay, and I've consulted with some of the legal folks that are working with people who are still held there, are intimately involved in psychological warfare in terms of how a prison is constructed, how often you surveil people, the noise that has to be involved, the disruption of sleep, the disruption of the senses, sensory warfare. I mean, that's why it's important for us to think about the things that like Disney is doing, because that is looks like an innocent version of that, but it's an extension of the fundamental structuring of our world as a carceral system that conscripts us actually into disciplining ourselves as well.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, it brought back the conversation I had, I guess 2 weeks ago now, with Nora Barros Friedman and her piece around, these Palestinian children in Gaza that were snatched up from this same Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution site where Palestinians are also shot. But they kidnapped all of these children, and what you just laid out is what they did to them. They put them in these sensory deprivation like chambers, like Nora said some of them described them as, like, it sounded to her like an incubator, like something incredibly hot, incredibly
like
small.
For fuck's sake.
Yeah.
Jesus.
And so you just think about that, and we know how much torture that the Zionist entity is engaged in. There's so much of it going on, and sexual violence and all of this. And, doing that to children that are going to get aid to try to extort information out of them or whatever. Like, it's just, yeah. And of course, as you're saying, I think it's just important to say that, like, whether psychologists are in the room in these things or
That's
not,
right.
like, it's all informed by
Yes.
psychology. Like, that it's all informed by study of what breaks people,
Yes.
and yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
the other thing, I mean, just to bring back to that piece from Counter for a second, just to underscore something that you said, and people might not be able to see that well, so I'll read it. But she says, layering is key. The concept should be used across outlets and groups, from social media to civil society to academia and political figures. Your audience needs to hear the same/similar messages from different perspectives at different times and from different outlets/channels. The repetition will help your message be front of mind, become an everyday viewpoint, and ensure that various audiences are exposed to the concept or message. And I just think it's so important for people to listen to that,
Mm-hmm.
because we always have these moments where we're like, why this week is everybody talking about this?
Yes.
And why are
Yes.
they all talking about it in this way?
Yes.
Like, why did this memo go out suddenly that these monsters care about starvation? Like, what are they playing upon in our
Yes.
emotions and our psychology? Like, is this to try to convince us that they're on our side? Like, what, and like,
Yeah.
you're not going to know the answer to all of those kinds of questions,
Yeah.
but you should just know that anytime that you see in mainstream media,
A
a bunch
pattern.
of similar stuff, or
Mm-hmm.
or even big podcasts, I would say
Yes.
too, um, that there's an initiative going on here. It's not just like, one guy comes out with something smart and everybody suddenly wants to platform him. I we get the most ridiculous emails at millennials of people who want to come on our podcast that we would never allow on in a million years. But I always share that with folks, because I'm like, that we're not even, our audience size is not at the scale
Yeah.
where they want to do, and they also know our politics. Again, like, people who are savvy enough at this know that we're the militants who would not be easily co-opted into their message. Most of
Mm-hmm.
the people that are sending us stuff are people that just don't really know what they're doing, and so it's like a PR agency that just mass blasts
Yeah.
out people that have this many followers and this word in their
Or they're
thing or
using you
whatever.
for legitimacy.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
sometimes. But if you're Tucker Carlson or
Yep.
Jon Stewart,
Yep.
or the what are those guys? What are the little Obama speechwriter boys that have their God Save America or Pod Save, whatever it is?
Yeah.
Um,
Same
these
shit.
people, yeah, like, that stuff is
Yeah.
absolutely a part of these kind of coordinated operations,
Yes.
and we should be aware of that at the very least.
Yes. Aware of that. And also, it gives us a blueprint about the force of our own repetition. They don't take a break. That's what she's saying. We inundate you, we flood you, and actually that's needed. Like, part of what she's saying is, to activate the lizard brain, you need to constantly be doing this. You don't get to do it one day and then rest the next day. That's the infrastructure. So for us, and this is where I'm concerned about with psychic militancy, is we need to take a clue about how repetitious this is. We don't get a day off. And that's actually really important for us, because sometimes I think people will share with me that they feel despairing, like, oh, I should have this skill already. But when you see the force of the repetition that's happening and the scale at which it's happening, it helps us see that we have to counter it with the same intensity of repetition. And this is where, like, my sort of tongue in cheek in the book and elsewhere that I've said is, like, we have to seize psychoanalysis as a concept called repetition compulsion. And it's often thought about as pathological, that we keep repeating because we haven't worked through some of the issues unconsciously that we need to work through. And my argument is like, let's seize that concept and understand that the repetition compulsion is necessary. We have to repeat over and over and over again to inoculate ourselves against these intrusions, against the way that the force of this happens, because the wear and tear is on purpose. And it's a practice, just like everything else. Like, there's a psychic practice. They're telling us that. They're saying part of how you do this is consistently message this so that there is wear and tear. So I feel like it's a really important reminder for us too, and to not despair when we're just like, oh shit, I'm waking up another day and I have to remind myself and I have to say this. And I'll tell you, a lot of people will tell me they sometimes have to remind themselves like out loud. And like, that's okay. That's how strong and forceful these intrusions are. And it's a good lesson for us about like, what am I repetitively coming back to, whether it's the structure or the intent or the fact that like genocidal fucks like this exist that are sitting there writing out in point form what people should be doing on the level of the university. This is not a conspiracy, folks. It's like from the smallest places to the larger sort of umbrella. And like, that's why we're constantly having to do this. That's why having these conversations are really important. That's why tuning in to podcasts like this is actually really important. It's not just an exercise. I know a lot of people are like, oh, you just keep talking. But if we can see what is being manipulated, it helps us understand that mobilizing not only counter discourse, but counter identifications. They're trying to create identifications in us. So our counter identifications become extremely important and life-sustaining.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say something too, just to clarify, which is I don't want to suggest to folks that I think I'm immune from these things. Like,
None of us
because
are.
I know
Yeah.
many times throughout this last couple of years that I have been watching the media, watching the different discourse and thinking, oh, like maybe there will be a ceasefire. Like these kind of, and like it's that's how effective the stuff is that you can be aware that that what you're that what you're listening to or watching is intentionally a kind of part of a psychological warfare effort. And this is part of what makes psychological warfare effective, is that you never quite know what the intent behind it is. And there's this thing of like, well, maybe it's true this time and maybe it's not. And maybe the reason, and so it doesn't give you a certainty, right? That like the media will, of course, the media says things that actually happen in the world, right? We're not saying that there isn't, that there aren't facts that are used in the media, right? Sometimes not, right? But sometimes there are. But the point is just to be very critical and suspicious and think about like, if we know that the United States is an enemy of the Palestinian people in the same way that the so-called state of Israel is, that, for things to show up in the New York Times, the Washington Post, all these different places, that it's not just there because it's the news. Like it's just not,
Right.
And all right, so let's see, there was something else. I think I don't really want to, I mean, for that very reason, like I saw that today Hamas reportedly agreed to the Egyptian Qatari Gaza ceasefire proposal. At the same time, you have Donald Trump tweeting out that, or truth socialing out, I don't know what they call their their tweets that basically that we will only see the return of the remaining hostages when Hamas is confronting or destroyed. Sooner this takes place, the better the chances will of success will be. Which, I mean, all I read into that is just that he's, as a lot of the Israelis have been doing in recent days, he's sort of priming people that
Yep.
they don't care about what happens to the
Yes.
hostages anymore.
Yes.
You know,
He's hedging too, right? He'll claim the victory if it happens, it's his. And then
mhm.
if it doesn't, then it's green light for, continuation of the final solution against Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously it will play out on the battlefield, and
Yeah.
the resistance is still fighting, and
Kicking ass.
still going to be giving hell to the Zionist forces that come in there. Um, and obviously people in Gaza are in just an absolutely horrendous state
Yeah.
right now. They're just not giving, it's awful. I mean, continuing to invade and destroy, I mean, I think that's the thing. Like,
Yeah.
there was a couple of interesting points recently. And I'm going to do a discussion with Adnan Hussein on Wednesday. It's not up yet, but we're going to do a little bit of a discussion on Zionism and Christian Zionism
Hmm.
and some of these doctrines and like the story of Amalek and like what does this mean to these people and all this kind of stuff. So that I'll save that, but it's an interesting, thing. But the I reference that because there's the question that was raised, and Justin Potter did it on a recent sit rep of the psychology or the rationale that would lead to just wanting to destroy every building,
Yeah.
and how it poses no, I mean, as he said it, it poses no strategic, real rationale behind it from a war perspective. Abdul Jawad had a different perspective on the same thing, which he said, look, like this is not new for Zionists
That's right.
to destroy our homes and our the the architecture of our lives, or
Yep.
however we would think about it. And folks should go listen to Abdul Jawad talk about it too, and I think they should also listen to Justin and his conversation on the sit rep. But um I think that's one of the things, is just the level of just trying to erase a people from the face of the earth. And I mean, that's obviously what genocide is.
And what
But
Zionism? Yeah.
yeah, it's the connection there. But it's so deep when you think about, like, it's the people, but also the proof of the existence of the people, right? Which
Yes.
again, like, it's like this is very colonial, right? It's like you could talk about the history of Africa, right? And all of the work that was done to try to destroy the, you know, what African people could know of their own history, right?
Yeah.
To destroy all of the artifacts and culture. And obviously you can't totally destroy these things, but like you can do a whole lot of damage as a colonial
Hmm.
project to these things.
Hmm.
um yeah, I don't know if I have a question. It's just something that I've
Well,
been thinking about.
one of the things I was thinking as you were talking is that also if ideological alignment works on identifications, we can think about, I agree to all of that, destruction of, of habitat, by the way, and erasure of presence, all these sorts of things, a rewriting of existence, collective punishment, all of that is part of it, which Abud is right. It's been that since the inception, because that is the centerpiece of Zionism, as I said, their colonial, framework. And if we shift to additionally thinking about ideological alignment as identifications, think about also the ways in which the people who they're bringing in to do this work now are also engaged they're giving them something to do to identify with the project of Zionism. That this is the project of Zionism that you go in and you destroy. And imagine the affective links that are involved. And we see this, by the way, in their documenting their war crimes, right? About like how casually they're like, we did this and we destroyed. And the other, last month we saw that the extreme settler who's like, I think partner, whoever it was saying, oh, you were so happy to be able to be involved in Gaza and to be able to demolish homes, right? There's something actually really important about making this a collective project and having people be involved in that. Like, to be part of the action means you're also supporting that action. And what type of action is it if I don't get to go in and be in on the destruction? And that's all that's fucking left to do right now. Number one, because you're a shitty army and the resistance is handing you your ass. But engaging in this repetitive act, we're back to the repetition of destruction, of demolition, matches the ideological currency of Zionism. And that's like, yeah, I'm a Zionist. I get to prove it because I demolish homes.
Yeah. I think so. I thankfully that reminded me too of one other point that we wanted to get to, which is a good one to kind of, start to move towards a close, which is just that, one of the things about Tufan al-Aqsa is that, the exposure of the kind of Zionist imperialist architecture of the world and its genocidal, all of its genocidal ambitions, right? Ideology in full view. And the way that this, in every community, I think, around the world too, to some extent, to varying degrees, has also exposed for folks like, where are the local nodes of this? Where are the people, the forces, the institutions that are like fully complicit and on board with this project, right? And obviously, on some level, I think that can be very overwhelming to people. It can lead to despair for people. It can lead to a realization of, my God, I thought there was more humanity in the world than this, and I can't believe how many people are either fully on board with this or aren't going after the people who are and the institutions who are, etc. So that's like one reality of that. But the other reality of it is that they've played their hands. Like, they are all out there now.
Yeah. Yep.
And for those of us who are committed to a free Palestine and also committed to a radical ethic of accountability around what complicity with this genocide, this Holocaust, um, the types of accountability that requires, that, there's like, I just think that there's so much coming for these like that. I don't see, I'm actually kind of at the point where, I don't know when this will happen, but I don't see a world in which Zionism can persist for, too much longer as the ruling ideology of a state. Like, I just think that, I know that might sound like maybe too hopeful for people or
No.
something, but I just don't see, so much of the world is so revolted and furious, rageful about this, rightfully so. And there are obviously, there's the Hind Rajab Foundation. There are groups who are trying to figure out and work on war criminal cases and all of these kind of things. But beyond even that, like, which I do think people should support those types of efforts for sure. But beyond even that, I just think that for people, like, there's no excuse for any of us not to dedicate ourselves to the organizing around that, and I think that it is a part of how we build the world that we want, you
Yes.
know.
Yes, on every level. And let me just sort of say is that Zionism, because it's a settler colonial and fascist ideology that thrives on ethno-nationalism, just like the context of the settler colony of the United States. I've never seen when every time we had visited Palestine, you know, the only other place I've seen this many flags to prove their existence is the United States and the settler colony that is now known as Israel. Like, if you're secure, you don't need to put up a fucking flag everywhere. So for me, psychologically, that's alerting us to something, that there's something that has to be proven every single day and re-adhered to every single day ideologically for this to continue. That ties into also the Zionist state's obsession with legitimacy. They're obsessed with being a legitimate state because they understand themselves fundamentally not to be. Now, ideologically, the point is to override that, because who the fuck cares? Because you could just do whatever you want when you have impunity and supported by the empires of the world. But that is what I want to tell folks, is that when you disrupt Zionism's ability to just function as a non-contested space, right? And of course, the most nefarious of that is sort of linking it up inextricably with Judaism, which is, there is a split, a massive split that is happening where people are no longer buying that shit, right? And a split within, I think, the Jewish community, as I follow along, about what that means. But that's the point of disrupting, like, Zionists being able to go just anywhere in the world, especially if they're engaging, like if they're putting their war crimes on and then they show up in a you know, on a vacation. This is where our comrades in Greece, like, show the fuck up. Like, let's learn something from our comrades in Greece, where they're just like, you don't get to, even if your boat docks, you don't get to enjoy thinking that anybody wants you here. You don't get to move through the world as a quote unquote proud Zionist and supporter of genocide and think that somehow everybody doesn't know this, right? Everywhere else in the world, people are marked by the most racist shit. Do we really think that genocidaires aren't going to be marked by this forever? And I think they should be. And we have, by the way, examples in history where people don't let go of the knowledge that these people were complicit, and their complicity was centrally located in the ideology of ethno-nationalist supremacy that they espouse, which is Zionism, right? And that's why I think for us to think about disrupting Zionist process at every level. And we can watch this. I think sometimes I've heard people say, oh, what's the point of this? Or what's it going to do? It's not stopping the genocide. You're right. I'm not saying that that's a replacement for that. But what it is doing is denormalizing Zionism in spaces as its instantiation of a genocide is happening in front of our eyes. And because it actually matters to them. You see how fucking angry they get when you see these videos. I mean, sex workers beating the shit out of Zionist folks, and I think it was in Thailand, or our Greek comrades, or people eating and not being able to eat, or our, hero in Spain, our Lebanese hero, who's just like, get the fuck out of here. I don't want your business. These reminders of, like, it's the days of being able to exist as a Zionist without that meaning what it has always meant, that you are pro-genocide against Palestinians, I think is gone. Like, I think you had said is that, like, can't put that back, the genie back in the bottle. That's it. This is what it means, which is also why they're working overtime with all these propaganda tours and the ADL and all these sorts of shit, because they recognize that their legitimacy in terms of all the fucking bullshit they've always shoved down our throats about democracy and all this, none of that is left. And right now, there's a choice people are making, is that what you have left, if you still support Zionism and the ability of Zionism to be concretized in an ethno-nationalist state that is now known as Israel, you are a genocidaire. Period. That's it. That's what you got. That's the choice you have, folks. And I think that that's okay for us to lean into that. Like, there is no nuance in this. This is just what it is right now. And anything for us to mobilize that. And again, when I say we have reminders of history, like apartheid South Africa, you have to create, you have to ostracize people who are willfully engaged in the act of genocide. There's no shame in that. That's just like, that's what we got to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm seeing people in the chat, bring up historical examples which are true, right? Which is that, a lot of Nazis didn't get accountability. They got university jobs, NASA jobs, CIA jobs, all of these kind of things, as well as a lot of them ended up in the West German government, which, should not be surprising given where Germany is right now politically. And I see people, I did see South Africa referenced by folks too, and saying, that there was not true liberation for Black South Africans, and that there was also not really true accountability for white South Africans. And I think both of those things are true. And I think that the reality is, though, that, for one, both of those states, if we use that as an example, they went through huge transitions, and we don't get to what we have now as Germany until after the Cold War, really. But you do have East Germany and West Germany. You do have, whatever people think about it. I mean, Nuremberg was a lot more accountability than we've seen for a lot of horrible things in the world. And I think on the South Africa tip, people would note that I searched up Georges Abdallah on Instagram's music thing for doing the little promo for this episode, and there was this story that I think it was his grandson, or was it his son?
I think it's the grandson.
Yeah, I think it was Nelson Mandela's grandson, talking at a Georges Abdallah rally in Europe, and telling the story of his grandfather being a political prisoner and all of this stuff. And I think that it is true that you'll never get full accountability for something this horrific. Like you won't. But also I think history does show a lot of examples, and not all. I mean, we have not had yet the full reckoning of the United States for all of its atrocities, for sure. I think that what we're seeing is part of the beginning of it. I don't want to spoil folks should listen to the Tanky Group Therapy conversation, because we talk about that in there. But I think, which will be out, I think, in the next day or so. But I do think that there is still this reality, as it can't continue to persist in the kind of form that it is, and it won't.
Yeah.
I just believe that, like, and people can think that I'm overly hopeful about that. I understand not feeling that optimistic about that right now. And I also understand that, as Frank McGinnis said in our conversation a couple weeks ago, like, we should all behave as if it's our responsibility to make sure that happens.
That's right. Right.
That we shouldn't assume it as an inevitability, right? Yes. And all I'm saying is, it's hard for me. And this is another thing Frank says, is like, I don't want to exist in the world where we don't have accountability around this.
Yes.
And I will refuse to live in that world, which will mean that I will dedicate my life to ensuring that happens. Yes. And, maybe I'll die before it happens, but I don't think so.
And for us not to sort of just connect accountability with like state accountability. We know South Africa state capture, all these sorts of things. People I think that's it also, is how are we thinking about accountability? What does it mean for us to practice that in our social relations, in our daily lives? What does it mean to enact that on every level? But what I would say is, I agree with you 100%. And at the very basic level, why would we give them the win beforehand? Why would we preemptively, like, feel so cynical that accountability is coming. Because again, if we go back to legitimacy, if we go back to impunity, if we go back to all of that, that's what they bank on. They bank on the fact that there will not be accountability, and they make us believe that there can't be a world in which that happens. That is also a psyops. That why preemptively give them that win? That I want to, and I don't think you're being too optimistic. I think we're trying to enact the world that we want to live in, just like the world in which there will be a liberated Palestine. I believe that with all my soul. There will be a liberated Palestine. That is not a delusion. That is not disconnected from reality. That's just a surety of it. And everything I do is dictated by that surety. And I think that's part of the accountability piece that we're talking about. And just as a reminder is that you're right, the true accountability that we're talking about, we want to also think about, like, what are the frameworks that we're looking at for this? Is it the law that we're talking about? Because like these last 2 years have fucking shown us that that's a sham, right? Many of us have already known that. The people who get the most, have violence most directed at them have always known that it's a sham. So is that what we're thinking about and that's why we get like cynical about it? Are there other ways? Because if we want to think about whether it's Nazis or Afrikaners in the context of South Africa, it's like, unless you're a fascist, nobody looks at Nazis and goes, they were the good guys, or Afrikaners are good. That's the whole fucking point. They're like the epitome of evil. And that is also something about, like, what does it mean to make Zionism play that role and fill that piece in our history and in our future, where it's synonymous, where you say, this is what it means to be a Zionist, and to have that become part of the fabric of the narration of history, right? That's, for me, that's accountability. Is like, yeah, I want forever for people to understand what Zionism meant and what it did.
Yeah, no, that's it. It is right. You're right about that, because I think that's the point, is that even when we talk about Nazis going into the CIA or going into the universities because they were Nazis. Like, we
Yes.
know how evil that is and what that says about
Yes.
the institutions that would welcome them into those places. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about that. And I think that that's the thing, is that there will be, and somebody said also in the chat that, like, well, actually, I don't even want to get into that, because I'm not gonna. But yes, I mean, that's the point, is that it is a political ideology, and this is the whole point about fighting Zionists, and Zionism, is that it's about their worldview, their belief system, their ideas, right? But this is what their ideas have done, right?
Yep.
And so now there's actually, I mean, we have 75 plus years, and this Holocaust is the cherry on the top of that, and
Mhm.
it just can't be brushed away
Right.
and brought into a debate, and these kind of things anymore. It's exposed itself for what it is, and the people who have supported it have exposed themselves as well. All right, is there anything else that you wanted to get to?
No, just plugging Lifeline for Gaza that you've been working on.
Yeah, let's do that. There's some things in the chat. So, this is about Georges Abdallah. So, Free Palestine TV has a great video there. Somebody also referenced Palestine Chronicle with Ramzi Baroud, I believe, is the one who runs that site.
Comrade George has been very busy.
Yeah, yeah. So there's good interviews out there. Listen to them. I don't know if this was in relation to Abdullah. I mean, he's Lebanese, first of all. So, like, but I think, that, I mean, we didn't talk about this. I do want to talk to Abdul Jawad about it, because he wrote a piece about it. But the Ben Gavir visit
Marwan Barghouti.
to, yeah, Barghouti.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, Barghouti is the one I most often hear from Palestinians, in that kind of resonance of our Mandela. Oliver Stone believes in the lizard brain too. Yeah, I think that actually comes up. So our episode of Imperial 80s that will air tomorrow, with Gemma DeCristo, which is just a lot of fun. We pre-recorded it, but we're gonna do a premiere tomorrow, and I'll be in the chat. But yeah, it's a Oliver Stone written movie, incredibly racist and Orientalist, like just
Surprise.
wildly so. um, Shout out to Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, MXGM, and BAM News Service. Their YouTube page recently had Hiram Rivera, Musa Springer, and Dr. CBS on speaking about Malcolm, George Jackson, and Walter
All awesome
Rodney.
people.
I'm sure that is great. I love
Mhm.
all those comrades. So that's great. Somebody referenced Doctors Against Gaza needing support right now. So
Against
just
genocide, yeah.
oh, sorry, Doctors Against Genocide.
Those
Wow.
are the Zionist
Not
version of
yeah,
doctors, Jay, that you're
Doctors Against
talking with.
Gaza.
They're Zionists. That's the Zionist cadre.
Thank you
Yeah,
for that correction. Wow, that was a
of
bad
course. Of
bad
course.
slip.
So you have Zionism on your mind. That's what
I
happens. Yeah,
do.
I'm actually going to be in Ann Arbor at a conference that they're holding, Doctors Against Genocide, in a couple weeks. So they're doing awesome work. Please do support them.
Awesome. Yeah. I'm sorry for pre-recorded episodes. Every once in a while we have to do it. I will say I really I think I did a very nice job of editing this episode, and there are some benefits to pre-recording in terms of how it aesthetically looks. So
Sina will be so proud.
don't judge. Yeah, I'll ask Sina to give me a grade on my
Editing.
editing skills afterwards. And yeah, I mentioned that we have Adnan on Wednesday. And we're next week on Imperial 80s. We're going to do Predator with Stephen Osuna. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I have coming. I need to get Karina Mullen on, or is it Corinna Mullen on to talk. She has written some really good pieces, part of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective, but also was fired from
Yeah.
CUNY, which is just disgusting. Solid, long time, supporter of Palestine, but also just really good. Like I think her work largely is around Tunisia, I believe, but just a really, really good scholar. So I'm glad that we're going to be talking with her soon. And then, yeah, I think next week we will have Abdul Jawad on to talk about his recent piece, and he'll probably write one between now and then too, because he's just constantly writing.
That's him.
And then also next week, I need to get this up on the 27th, is Felicia Deneau's last part of her autonomous frame of reference project, and Dylan Rodriguez is her guest for that.
Awesome.
So that'll be good. So Lara and we're figuring this out. I've proposed one, but I'm not gonna say what it is yet because she and Steven have to. It will happen. We just haven't decided fully. So stay tuned for that. But we
So
will get
part
them
of the
on.
let me say what the backstory is for me, at least on this, just for that question,
Sure.
is that because I was not reared in the belly of the beast, I'm a little shy to be engaging in this. And I've told Jay before that I'm just going to be like a fucking hater. I know that's the point. I know that's it. But like part of the project is also like rewatching things that maybe people are reared on and sort of seeing it. So that has been part of the, my own hesitation around this, and really just wanting to watch people riff that have been deeply immersed in this. But anything for Jay. So I think it's a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that again, I'm not going to spoil it, but the movie that I proposed is so bad that the whole point, like anybody who has a positive association with it, like we need to hear the most searing, eviscerating critique of this thing as possible, because the fact that were implanted with this as children, is just yeah. Mtube's in the chat. He's like, it's birth of a nation levels. That's right. It is. It's birth of a nation level racist.
You
So
got me.
and it's a birth of a nation level racist, and the racism is directed at Palestinians, Lebanese people, and Iranians, really. So
Yep.
it's yeah. Somebody's question. I'm not gonna tell what it is yet. All right.
You can keep a secret.
All right.
And I'm a
Anyways, this has been
therapist,
great.
so that's my job.
Well, thank you again, Lara. This has been great.
you as
And I'm sure we will do another one of these soon to talk,
Yes.
to talk more. So,
Yes.
all right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.